Speaking of those windows of opportunity, with the areas that are held under rebel factions, is it easy to access these areas? I know you said sometimes it's difficult to get through, difficult to find out who's in charge. They change hands so quickly. How do you manage to get through?
Well, there's the situation of the fluidity of the conflict, as you pointed out, but there are some opposition groups that simply do not want the United Nations agencies moving into their territory. And we have to respect that. If they are telling us that they don't want us there, we're not going to force our way in. So we have to negotiate on the ground, often with local leaders at a very, very local level, to ensure that we can get the access and to give us the assurance that our people and the assets that we take in, the trucks themselves, are going to be able to get in and get out and do their job effectively. It's very, very challenging.
Okay, before I come back to you on Nicholas, can I just bring you in here, talking about the international efforts with many of these countries. You just saw Egypt there. John Kerry, speaking to the Egyptian Foreign Minister, is saying there has been progress made. Has there been progress made?
Well, I can give you 683 reasons why progress hasn't been made, and those are all the people who were sentenced to death on Monday. I think it's time for the US authorities and the international community to wake up and realize that Egypt is going through a human rights crisis. Now, there are a number of ways the international community can address this. The first is they need to stop giving the Egyptian authorities the weapons they use to commit gross human rights violations. We're very disappointed that the US government is readying Apache gunships to pass to the Egyptian authorities. But the second is also to look at the scale of trade and aid that affects Egypt. You know, trade and aid to Egypt from the US and the EU is the Bermuda Triangle, because human rights gets lost in the middle. US funding for human rights makes up, I think, less than 1% of the total 1.3 billion that they provide to Egypt every year. We're not calling for aid to be conditional, but we are calling for the authorities in the EU and the US to realize that Egypt is undergoing gross human rights violations, not just unfair trials, but also deaths of hundreds of protesters in the streets and the thousands of people who are now languishing in jail for questioning the authorities.
Okay, we're going to come back to that and as our feature story later on in the programme. But before we move away from this part of the discussion, Greg, can I ask you about the Central African Republic and the relief efforts that are taking place there? Now, we've seen hundreds of thousands of Muslims fleeing Bangui just this week. What is it like for these people who are leaving their hometowns with nothing?
I'd say it's pretty desperate. We're moving into the rainy season in the Central African Republic. It means that access to these populations once they're on the move is going to become much more difficult. And while we all recognise that the security situation there is very, very bad, I think there are two other challenges that the humanitarian agencies face in trying to help these people. One is the logistical challenge that's thrown up by the rainy season, which essentially turns the roads into rivers of mud across the country.
I mean, we saw some of that footage there in the news. A lot of the trucks couldn't actually
They can't get through. But on top of that, the world doesn't seem to recognise that this crisis is happening, and the agencies that are trying to work there on the ground are simply not getting the resources that they need to carry out their work. And with the rainy season getting underway, it's so important for us to move supplies into storage areas around the country so it's there for the people when their communities get cut off by the rain, and also to be ready to do airlifts if necessary, which are much, much more expensive. But at the moment, the support is simply not there.
We saw some of those airlifts earlier in the year, but we will be following that story with the World Food Programme and others who are working in the Central African Republic. Now, with over 600 people sentenced to death through mass trials, the Egyptian judiciary has had a busy week in court.
682 individuals, including Muslim Brotherhood General Mohammed Badi, were sentenced to death. The defendants were accused of inciting violence and murdering a policeman in the town of Al-Adwa in Egypt's southern province of Minya last year. The cases follow a violent crackdown on the Muslim Brotherhood since the ousting of Egypt's first freely elected president, Mohamed Morsi, last July in a military coup. Hundreds have been killed and thousands arrested, with over 500 of the group's alleged supporters already sentenced to death in similar mass trials. The speed of these hearings has been criticized by the United Nations and international rights organizations.
It sounds to me like if you can convict one person, 500 people or more of injuring or killing one policeman, it's ridiculous.
Families have been left distraught at what they are calling outright injustice.
فايت لي اثنين وقاعده بالايجار يا ابوي وقاعده بالايجار يا ابوي ابني مظلوم ابني مظلوم يجي لا يا ابوي مش اخوان يا ابوي لا يا ابوي لا يا ابوي الاخوان هنا ولا هربانين يا ابوي عملها وخلعوا.
The sentences will be reviewed by the Grand Mufti of Egypt, the top Islamic authority, with a decision due in June. As a result of the military coup, the historic Islamic movement who took authority in 2012 has largely been driven underground. Subject to a wave of prosecutions and declared a terrorist organization, Army General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who took reins after the coup, has ensured the Brotherhood movement has had little space to maneuver. Nearly a year ago now, Muslim Brotherhood General Mohammed Badi spoke to tens of thousands of peaceful demonstrators, reminding them to remain peaceful. But with a death sentence hanging over his head and the driving down of opposing voices, there is little peace in Egypt at the moment.
Joining us in the studio now, Brother Yasir Reda from Islam 21C and, of course, Nicholas Piachud. Right, we saw there, as you mentioned earlier, Nicholas, 683 prisoners. I just want to come to you, Yasir, first. You've been following this on Islam 21C. We saw the mass trial in March, 529 people, and now this one. How do you react to something like that?
I think this is not something that's surprising. I think this has been the tactic of the military dictatorship ever since Abdel Nasser. And it's a form of mental torture, because although the executions might not go ahead, they attempt to scare people, they attempt to drive down their resolve, and I think that this is what the main aim of this is to do. I think that it's a very sorry state of affairs that the rhetoric around what's happened is strong, but in reality the action is not really there.
Rhetoric, Nicholas, we saw the judges who handed down the verdicts come out and say, well, defending their verdicts and saying, well, actually, this is the case, severe punishment is needed because some of these individuals aren't there in the court.
Well, let's get one thing very clear from the start. This was a grossly unfair trial in which most of the defendants weren't in court and weren't brought to court if they were in detention. And that was verified by an Amnesty International observer who was actually at the courts. I mean, this was a gross violation of the right to life. It's not just the action of a rogue judge, like some people have said. It's pointing to a criminal justice system which is spiraling widely out of control. And I think the question needs to be asked, is Egypt's judiciary really independent? Or is it just another cog in the authorities' machinery of repression?
Well, with these particular cases, this now goes to the Grand Mufti, right?
That's correct.
Okay, so if it's going to a religious figure, now this individual, what are we expecting to see as a result of that?
I think my expectation is that a huge number of the death sentences will be reduced to a life sentence, which means probably at least 25 years in prison for each of the individuals involved. I think probably some of the verdicts will be upheld. That is probably my take on what will happen. But I think that with it going to the Grand Mufti, it doesn't really change too much because he is a government employee, in my opinion.
Now, on the Islam 21C, you've been following how the Muslim Brotherhood and what's been happening in Egypt. Now, with this verdict, the last one, with Mohammed Badi and the individual senior figures from the Muslim Brotherhood, now, it's a clampdown on the religious movement in Egypt?
I think it definitely is a clampdown on the religious movement, but what's happened as well recently with the April the 6th movement, who have been clamped down as well, I think it's more a clampdown on all opposition that's against the heinous crimes of the military coup that's happening in Egypt.
Clampdown of voices. Why doesn't the international community do anything?
Well, I think the international community has responded with sort of knee-jerk reactions. So we've seen widespread condemnation of the latest death sentences and of the continued crackdown. But I think more is needed here. I think the international community was taken by surprise with the uprising in 2011. But I don't think it's fair for them to turn around 3 years later and say that they're still trying to sort their act out. It's time for a longer-term strategy to deal with the gross human rights violations that we're seeing in Egypt today. Part of that has to be the continued suspension of weapons and equipment which facilitate human rights violations. But there also has to be continued pressure on the Egyptian authorities and condemnations as well.
Okay, well, in regards to the weapon and military sort of, I know we've heard about aid earlier in the news. Mm-hmm. Obama has restored aid, which 6 months ago, which was taken off?
Well, we're talking about, the $1.3 billion that the US has been providing to Egypt since the 1980s, and that's mostly military aid, which was part suspended after the mass killings at Rabat al-Adawiya in August last year. But I think there's a wider concern here. It's not just the US which is making ready to restore military aid to the Egyptian authorities, but also the EU states who are also beginning to push towards restoring these transfers of weapons and equipment. And that would send a very strong signal to the Egyptian authorities that all they've received from the international community is a slap on the wrist, and that they can continue doing business as usual.
Well, business does seem to be continuing as usual. Brother Yasir, did you have any final comments on that?
I think it's important to learn the lessons from what's happened in Egypt and for everyone to choose their allegiances very carefully.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your comments. Lots of things have been trending on Twitter throughout this week. Let's have a look at some of your tweets.
Trending on Twitter this week, Below the Line. The online community from around the world tweeted about the Below the Line initiative, where people decided to spend £1 a day, 5 days on food and drink. As May Day brought people out onto the streets, workers expressed their thoughts on the holiday intended to honour workers. At Walthamstow Forest Trade Union tweeted, "We're joining London May Day March in memory of RMT Union General Secretary Bob Crow." Nigeria kidnapped girls was also trending. The Twitter sphere was in anger at the news of kidnapped schoolgirls, with Batstania 2 tweeting, "Can I just ask, why does it take 2 whole weeks for the world to sit up and notice?" Also trending this week, BNP video. The BNP submitted the public election broadcast, which broadcasters couldn't show, leading the party to release their video online.
Unfortunately, that is all we've got time for this evening, but of course we'll be following your stories throughout this week and next. I want to thank my guests, Nicholas Piachud, Yasir Reda, and of course Gregory Barrow for joining us, and you at home for watching. Remember to keep up the Twitter conversation using #TheReport. You can also email us your thoughts on the report at islamchannel.tv. But before we leave you this week, thousands of activists all over the world have been living below the poverty line to raise awareness of global poverty. Myself included, we've been living on £1 a day. Some of our team went to Somaliland to find out about relief work there for individuals who live below the poverty line all year.